Breadbox Media programming is brought to you by Jack Kane Ford. Find your next Ford Tough vehicle at caneford.com. Woodhill Community Center. Have a hand in the heart of the city. Support their mission with your donations at woodhillcommunitycenter.org. Toyota on Nicholasville Superstore. Online consultants are standing by right now to help you find your next Toyota. Visit toyotaonnicholasville.com. Lexus of Lexington, home of the best-selling Lexus IS. Find yours today at lexusoflexington.com.
Well, hey, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Lisa, Hendey, and Friends. Astute friends will notice that I was quiet last week as we took a week off for Memorial Day. I hope you had an excellent holiday weekend, that it was a wonderful remembrance for you of all those who gave such a beautiful sacrifice to our country, that you had some downtime with your family. I certainly did, and I'm happy that I've actually been in my home zip code for the last week and a half, which is kind of a world record for me these days. So it's really nice to be back behind the microphone with you this week and to share what I think will be a wonderful segment of podcasting fun. Joining us today is a very special guest who, when his book crossed my desk, I've realized the Holy Spirit sometimes sends me past guests, and I think actually that today's guest is a special one of those. Tom Elliott is a certified spiritual director, and he's the owner of Deepwardly Spiritual Direction Services, and also the author of a brand new book called The Intimacy You Desire. Now, this great book offers insights to us from St. Ignatius of Loyola into how you and I can develop mutuality and intimacy with God. And really, when we call this show Lisa, Hendey, and Friends, I think the greatest source of all friendship in my life is God. So a deepening intimacy with God, I'm all in. Welcome to the show, Tom Elliott.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm grateful for your generosity in having me here.
Well, it's a treat. And like I said, I think that I am going to be benefiting so greatly from your book, and I hope our listeners will too. You know, before we get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? We have your bio, and that'll be in our show notes, but who's Tom Elliott?
Well, let me just say, there are very few people in the world who get to do what they absolutely love to do all day long, and I count myself among those privileged few because I get to do spiritual direction with people all day long and offer retreats and presentations, and that's just an amazing thing. My passion, if people ask for what is Tom Elliott's deepest passion, my passion is spirituality, and even more concretely, personal prayer. Helping people to develop and deepen a sense of intimacy and mutuality with God through personal prayer. So I'm really grateful that I have an opportunity every day to do that.
That's great. And you're in the position of being full-time in spiritual direction. I did a little bit of research on the services that you provide. You're located in Arkansas, is that correct?
I am. I'm in central Arkansas in a suburb of Little Rock. But I have clients all over the country and even Europe, thanks to the telephone and FaceTime and Skype.
So, that's good to know. So you do directees both virtually and in person.
I do, and it's probably about half and half. Probably half of my directees are here in Arkansas, and half are outside of the state.
Interesting. So let's step back for a moment, just in case there's anybody who's listening that's not familiar with this concept of spiritual direction. So what exactly is, I know you spell this out on your website a little bit, it's not coaching, it's not counseling per se. What really is spiritual direction?
Well, and Lisa, if you asked 20 different people, you would get 20 different answers. But just my own personal answer is that spiritual direction is really a companioning. A spiritual director, in my opinion, is not someone who's giving answers, but he or she is providing this sacred space through which the Holy Spirit and the directee can experience clarity. Sometimes that means answers. Sometimes it might just be a clarity about an experience, but it's really a companioning.
I like that, a companioning along our path to God. That's beautiful. And I know that your interest is particularly in Ignatian spirituality, and with our Holy Father, being a Jesuit, there's just this explosion of interest these days in what it was that Saint Ignatius was leading us to in his writings. Why do you think people are so interested in Ignatian spirituality these days?
I think it's really because it's so practical. We really desperately want a spirituality where the rubber meets the road, where there's a real sense of the concreteness of an experience of God. And Ignatius offers that. His spiritual exercises, which I don't recommend people just sit down and read. It's meant to be a handbook, a retreat book for a spiritual director to use to direct someone. But in that retreat book called the Spiritual Exercises, there's just so much practical information and help to deepening that intimacy with God. So I think it just resonates with people. Even Ignatius recognized that we live very, very busy lives. And so he offers even some practical advice on how we can fit that relationship with God into the mix of all of the other relationships and activities in our lives. So I think that just resonates with people.
It's certainly a lot of what I read so far in your book has resonated with me. And I wanted to point our listeners just to this one little section. I'm going to read a portion of your book, Tom, that really struck me as I was musing over it. You say, notice the goal is not to get to a place such as heaven, nor is the goal to accomplish holy things such as growing in virtue or appeasing a demanding God. Instead, the goal is being with a person, God, and use capital P there for person. To be with God means to know God. Therefore, Ignatius is not inviting us to know about God, but rather to know God more easily. I was really struck by that because I kind of told myself, like, how much of the time that I spend praying is really kind of this intellectual pursuit of reading books and trying to kind of like figure out all the facts that there are to know about theology and history and great spiritual teachers. I think you really struck a chord in my heart when you talked about this being known and knowing God. And don't you think that's really what people are kind of longing for in their prayer lives these days?
Absolutely. The explosion of Facebook, Twitter, all of the social media just speaks this language that we deeply desire to be known and to be heard. I think that's a spiritual desire. I think we probably look for it in most of the wrong places, but to just learn more about someone or for them to just learn more about us isn't what our heart is deeply longing for. We're wanting an intimacy that's so much deeper than just memorizing some new verses or learning a new devotion. Those are great if they're leading us into that intimacy.
So in the book, The Intimacy You Desire, you use the analogy of a couple. You call them Rick and Megan, and you kind of walk us through, the process of the spiritual exercises through the insight of this, of their relationship. Can you just say a little bit about that and how that figures into what someone who's not familiar with the spiritual exercises can understand of them?
Absolutely. And that's really one of the most unique things about my book is it presents the 4 weeks or the 4 stages of relationship with God and the spiritual exercises in terms that we're used to in human relationships. I don't know of any other book that really lays it out that way. Without that sort of connection to human relationship, I think the spiritual exercises are by and large very, very confusing. But my own spiritual director led me through the spiritual exercises over the course of a little over 4 years, where I would spend 1 to 2 hours every day in prayer with the meditations from the exercises, just going at my own pace, sometimes spending weeks on one meditation. And what I discovered was, wow, in week 1 of the spiritual exercises, we're really being invited to not only fall in love with God, but to recognize being rescued. And the more I dove into that, I began realizing, ooh, that's what happens when couples fall in love. There's this real sense of not being rescued in terms of being fixed, but being rescued in terms of being accepted. That not only do they fall in love, but there is this moment of, oh, I don't have to hide who I most authentically am, and I'm accepted by this other person. Well, that's the grace that St. Ignatius of Loyola knew that we needed to experience with God in order to deepen that intimacy. And for Ignatius, that meant us moving into week 2 of the spiritual exercises, where we become a good friend to Christ. And so all of a sudden, there's this movement from being rescued by this benefactor to, oh, I'm a friend of Christ, and I'm invited to get to know him. And of course, Ignatius in week 2 invites us to use imaginative prayer to get to know Christ, where we're imagining ourselves as being part of all of the different gospel stories, not just knowing the verses, but really, I like how Father George Aschenbrenner, a Jesuit author, puts it, where we're really being invited into the sanctuary, the tabernacle of Christ's heart in week 2, to not just know about him, but to know him. And as we do that, eventually, just like in human relationships, we move from being a good friend to being a best friend. And that's week 3 of the spiritual exercises. Now, the majority of Christians never get into week 3 of the spiritual exercises, because that's where we're invited to be with Christ in his suffering. And one of the most vulnerable moments in the book for me is sharing my own experience of week 3 of the spiritual exercises. It's going to be very different for each person, but it can be a very, very difficult time. You know, our best friends in human relationships tend to be those people who are with us in our darkest times. And that's what we're invited to do with Christ. In his passion, we're invited to be with him every step of the journey. Ignatius, in fact, sets aside any of his own meditations and ideas for prayer in week 3, and all we're invited to do is go back to those passion narratives in the 4 Gospels over and over and over, and to then just wait for the resurrection, that it's not something that we can make happen, but as in human relationships, there's this movement even deeper than being best friends. There's finally a moment in which we realize that the other person is our beloved. And Ignatius uses this powerful word of mutual to describe that relationship. I mean, that should almost, Lisa, be scandalous to us, because it's so intimate to think that we're invited through the exercises, through a deepening intimacy with God, to a mutuality with God. And Ignatius defines that as a complete sharing of goods and selves, that we offer everything to God and he offers everything to us. And we experience there a whole new freedom in our lives, a tremendous joy in our lives. It doesn't take away the painful circumstances of our life, but all of a sudden we're infused with a joy and a hope, because we know that the Father wants to give us our heart's deepest desires, our most authentic desires, just as he did Christ through the resurrection and ascension. So it was really a life-changing thing for me, Lisa, to recognize that what Ignatius was inviting us to in those 4 weeks wasn't theoretical, it wasn't necessarily intellectual, but that it was relational, that, these are things that we've experienced with some of the most important family members and friends in our lives, and we're being invited to experience them with God. That was powerful.
It is powerful. And I think it was funny. I was sitting out on my little patio this morning with your book, reading it. And if folks can take a look, maybe you can pull up the book somewhere online and take a look at the cover. I thought to myself, I wonder what my husband would think if he walked out here and saw me reading this book called The Intimacy You Desire. But there on the cover of the, I thought, what if he just looks at the spine of the book and what does he think I'm out here reading or whatever? But then on the cover is just this beautiful image of St. Ignatius. And so then I figured, okay, I think I'm in good shape. But it had me kind of in a little bit of just a mental thought about how this most important of relationships or most important of friendships, our relationship with God, the God who loves us so greatly, like how when we put a striving effort into building that relationship, how that can impact on all the other relationships in our lives. Am I on to something with this?
I'm sorry, what was that, Lisa?
Oh, I'm just wondering if it's possible that when we, give really a focused effort, maybe through spiritual direction or through reading a book like yours, when we really strive for a deeper relationship with God, it seems to me that that's bound to impact the other relationships in our lives, whether that's with our spouse or friends or relatives, that there's a trickle-down effect. Am I on to something there?
Absolutely. I mean, undoubtedly. And I experience that and hear about that all of the time through the ministry of spiritual direction. Oftentimes, in fact, directees, without even being conscious of it, will be sharing these beautiful parallels in their relationship with God and the relationship with a spouse or a coworker or a friend. I find myself in spiritual direction as I'm directing people, even inviting them to look at those connections to see if it's a deeper movement that's going on. In other words, if a directee is sharing with me that she's really struggling to be honest with God about how she's feeling, I might ask an evocative question like, well, have you experienced the same thing with your husband recently? And you can tell by the look on the face that, I've not thought about that. And so often it's an exact parallel that when we're pulling away or leaning into one relationship, we tend to be pulling away or leaning in to all of the relationships.
So I know a good number of my listeners right now are thinking to themselves, okay, well, Lisa, I'm listening to your podcast while I'm driving to work or I'm doing the laundry or I'm trying to fit in a bit of exercise and my life is so busy. And, you're asking me not only to read a book, but to consider doing one more thing, and which is committing to spiritual direction. And I'm so busy. So how would you answer that person if they felt that way, just overwhelmed by life?
To be honest, Lisa, I know a lot of people feel that way. My opinion is when people recognize the value and the need for spiritual direction, or let's go much broader than that, when they recognize the need and the importance of just a non-negotiable amount of time in personal prayer each day, then they're going to find the time for it. We all have the same 24 hours each day. And there are probably a lot of people who aren't to that place yet. That's not necessarily a priority in their lives. But I have directees who are pastors, deacons, young mothers with children, fathers, CEOs of companies they all find that time, and sometimes creatively. I will say the pastors tend to be the most creative people in trying to fit personal prayer into the busyness of their day. But they find time to do that, and they find that hour once a month for spiritual direction. So I think when we find ourselves deeply needing it, we will make time for it, almost like eating. Even on a busy day, when we get hungry enough, we will find a way to eat, even if it's at our desk at work.
Or in our car, or on our way to exercise.
Mm-hmm.
It's so beautiful that you mentioned kind of this, this longing that we have for quiet time, for prayer time. I'm wondering what your personal prayer life looks like. You're in a position of being, one who kind of accompanies others along their own path to God. But what does your daily prayer routine look like in your life?
Well, it's the very first thing in the morning, because I learned years ago that if I wait to do prayer, then it will not happen. It just absolutely won't happen. And so I actually usually wake up before the alarm clock goes off, so I'm usually awake before 5 a.m. The very first thing I do is head to that Keurig coffee maker, and I make a hot cup of coffee, what I like to call Java with Jesus, and I sit down in my prayer chair, and that is, and I say this with complete honesty, it's my favorite time of the day. There's absolutely nothing else going on. There are no distractions or demands. I have a special prayer chair, a little area where I've got my prayer journal and my Bible, my reading glasses, and I sit down in that chair, and I always start my personal prayer with the Liturgy of the Hours, with morning prayer, and I try to offer that up for any one of my directees who has mentioned that they would like some extra prayer. So, if someone's going on a trip or they've got a surgery coming up, so I'll offer up that morning prayer for them in a very specific way and let them know that I'm doing that particular morning. That really just helps wake me up, too. So that 10 or 15 minutes in those scripture readings, doing what I would consider intercessory prayer, praying for the church, the world, for specific people, that helps me to just wake up. Then after that, and I describe this in the book based on some of Ignatius's recommendations, after that, I go to my prayer journal and look at the previous day's entry just to remind myself, what was the topic of conversation? Ignatius calls it a grace. What's the grace that we're praying for? I like to use the phrase topic of conversation. So if I look through my journal and I realize, oh, yeah, yesterday, God, we were talking about the gift of humility, then I'll just name that and say, God, I desire to deepen that gift of humility, and I want us to visit about it today. It kind of sets the stage. It would almost be like if we got together with a friend at Starbucks for a cup of coffee, if there was something really important we wanted to talk about, we would probably name it. We wouldn't try to casually, slide into it. We would say, I would really like to talk with you about this. So I simply name that topic of conversation. I look for some way to creatively unpack it in prayer, to try to find some way to creatively meditate on it, whether it's a scripture on that topic or an image off the internet or a poem or a memory from my own life or an experience from my own life, just anything to kind of get that conversation and meditation going with God. And then prayer usually ends with me doing a little bit of journaling, so I have a sense of where I'm going to pick up that conversation the next day. So that's kind of my personal prayer time in a nutshell.
I love it. I ask this question frequently because I feel like that, like you, that's the best part of my day. And it's also one that I occasionally don't make time for, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I'm perfectly fine when I'm at home and things are according to their routine, but I do a lot of traveling in my life. So I'm still working on what's my portable morning prayer time look like. So I think I learned so much from hearing from other people. I'm curious, a couple of specific questions about your prayer of Liturgy of the Hours, because I think that's such a beautiful gift to our days. Do you pray with a device, or do you pray with the books, or how do you pray Liturgy of the Hours?
I use the iBreviary app. Years ago, when I did a pilgrimage to Italy, I realized, I do not want to be carrying around 500,000 books. And so I kind of bit the proverbial bullet at that point and started using a Bible app, a journal app, and the iBreviary app. And so my iPad tends to be used quite a bit during personal prayer time as I go through those three things.
That's awesome. I find when I do that too, which I do regularly, that turning off my push notifications is a good personal move for me, so I'm not being bombarded with email while I'm in the middle of my prayer. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. For folks that are out there that are kind of wanting to think about, being ready for spiritual direction, or how to go about finding a spiritual director, what do you recommend, and how do you know when a spiritual director is maybe not the right fit for you?
One of the first things I recommend is I've got a couple of different free webinars on my website that actually answer the exact question you just asked, that really talk about what are the signs that we're ready for spiritual direction. What can we expect to get out of spiritual direction? How would we prepare for a meeting with a spiritual director? So all of those things are really, really helpful. But I think first and foremost, if we've decided, Lisa, to make our relationship with God intentional, that's an important word, intentional, then we are ready for spiritual direction. So just like if we're wanting our relationship with a spouse to be intentional, not just haphazard, where it happens if it happens, but then we're going to take some steps to make sure that relationship is healthy and holy. I would say the same thing is true in our relationship with God, that if we're wanting it to be intentional, starting to pray more regularly, being more conscious of God outside of prayer, then we are ready for spiritual direction.
You heard it, friends. You're ready. So the webinars and other digital resources that Tom Elliott has been mentioning can be found over on his website. It's deepwardly.com, deepwardly.com. We'll have that linked up in our show notes. Tom, I know you're active on Facebook too. What do people find over at your Facebook page? On my personal page, I often just post personal things. Imagine that. Imagine that. I share with people what's going on in my life. On the regular page, I do some live, on the business page, on the ministry page, I do some live reflections occasionally, just throwing out some insights that sometimes directees have shared with me, some of their aha moments that we all need to hear. I also give updates about the retreat cottage ministry that we're currently building. We eventually will have a retreat cottage here in Central Arkansas where people can come, or married couples can come and do Ignatian silent retreats. So I always post updates anytime I'm out at that retreat cottage land working. I let people know about it and post pictures of the progress and that sort of thing. That sounds amazing. What are the plans for the cottage? When will that be completed?
That is a wonderful, wonderful question. We are literally just now beginning to talk with the bank to find out how much more fundraising we have to do in order to be able to move forward with the building plans. So I'm hoping to know more in the next few weeks, and we still have one more fundraising social here in the Central Arkansas area to do. But In the meantime, I've been putting in my own sweat equity. I've learned how to build a fence. Well, I say that, Lisa, but you know what? If in a few weeks the fence falls over, then I don't really think I can say that I learned how to build a fence. But at this point, all I can really say is I've watched a lot of YouTube videos on how to build a fence. So we'll see.
Well, I'm sure it's going to be an amazing place when it's completed. And in the meantime, folks can go over to your website at deepwordly.com and avail themselves of all the resources. And I especially want to point my friends to this wonderful book, The Intimacy You Desire, Growing in Love with God Through the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius. Tom Elliott, are there any kind of closing thoughts that you'd like to share today with our listeners?
Well, I did want to make a quick point because you really highlighted this twice, Lisa, as you were sharing, and that is, while our personal prayer may or may not happen at a specific time, there are all of those moments throughout the day that could be opportunities. And Father George Aschenbrenner, who is one of my teachers in training for spiritual direction, uses a phrase in one of his books. He talks about the continuity of consciousness. What he means by that is what's happening during personal prayer time, the same thing that's happening throughout the rest of the day. In other words, if we're praying about humility and we're reading a scripture passage in prayer about humility, are we being reminded all throughout the day to put that gift, that virtue, into practice so that there becomes this ongoing conversation with God? I offer some beautiful resources for developing that on my online School of Spiritual Formation. But, for example, one of those is whatever the topic of conversation is that I'm having with God, I change the wallpaper on my phone to remind me of that. So if I'm praying about growing in contentment, then I will create a digital sticky note as the wallpaper on my cell phone so that every time I get on there, I'm being reminded of the gift of contentment, or I'm setting an alarm on my phone in the evening to go off and remind me to reflect on, when was I the most content today? When was I the least content today? So we're really, really busy, but we also have so many different resources at our fingertips to be deeply intentional and relational.
That's beautiful. I love the concept of tying your conversation with God towards your examen as I think a very fruitful and kind of holistic approach to prayer. That's beautiful. Well, Tom, I'm so grateful for your time and for the gift of this beautiful book. I wonder if I might avail on you at some point in the future to come back when I've finished the book for a follow-up. Could we arrange a future conversation?
Absolutely. That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful.
Good. Well, in the meantime, I can't wait to go over and check out some of the resources at deepwordly.com. And I'm truly just very grateful to call you a new friend and to be able to get to know you better through this amazing work and the intimacy you desire. Again, friends.
Well, thank you for your ministry.
Oh, well, it's a very... I have a lot of fun, and it's a great honor, especially to get to meet people like you. So, friends, be sure to check out Tom Elliott and get your copy of The Intimacy You Desire at your local Catholic bookstore or anywhere online where books are sold. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Well, friends, as we close out this week's episode of Lisa, Hendey and Friends, I want to invite you to share your feedback. If there's something that you heard today that you have a question about, or something on a recent episode that's really spoken to you, or some suggestions, especially that you have for me on what you'd like to hear in the future, don't hesitate to reach out. You can get me by sending an email to lisahendey@gmail.com, or simply leave a comment on the blog post at lisahendey.com, or find me on social media at Lisa Hendey, just about everywhere. Anywhere you're online, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, I'm there. So I love getting your feedback, and I love hearing how the podcast is helping you along your path to friendship with God and those around you. Until next week, I wish you a wonderful week, and I hope that today has been a blessing to you. Please know that you'll be in my prayers, and until next time, have a great week. God bless, friends. Bye-bye.
Breadbox Media programming is brought to you by...
We want to help others, especially in places of strife, such as the Holy Land, where Christianity is dwindling by the day. But how to help? Here's an easy way: buying products through the Holy Land gift shop. Every product you purchase at myfranciscan.org/shop helps Christians support their families and stay in the Holy Land. Olive wood, embroidery, spices, and many more authentic products from the Holy Land are available right now at myfranciscan.org/shop. The Holy Land Gift Shop, bringing the Holy Land home.
Thank you for listening to Breadbox Media. Find more about us at breadboxmedia.com.